All right. Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, November 14th. This is SIG Testing's weekly meeting. I am Aaron Krickenberger, and this is being publicly recorded and will be posted to YouTube eventually. Which, side administrivia note, I know I'm still behind on posting last week's recording. I should get to that later today, assuming I actually have it with me. Otherwise, it's going to have to wait a couple weeks. So I wanted to talk briefly about a proposal that I finally got some time on that was initially wordsmithed by Jace around how we define the criteria for release blocking jobs and merge blocking jobs. I've linked it in the agenda, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can all see what I'm talking about. Okay, so this proposal here, the TLDR is trying to really admit that this is just a first pass. I'm trying to put a stake in the ground for today. This isn't intended to be like the forever engraved in stone thing, but we want enough actual numbers that we can sort of objectively identify when things are misbehaving, as well as when things are valid to be considered release or merge blocking. And we want to have sort of a human review to sort of understand that everybody's acting in the collective best interest here. So I went based on metrics that I can easily glean by looking at test grid. I can pretty quickly figure out whether or not a job, by looking at the test duration minutes graph on test grid, I can pretty easily see whether a job averages finishing a run in less than 60 minutes. I can figure out pretty quickly if that job runs at least every 2 hours. I can figure out if that job passes 90% of its runs in the past week based on the summary tab. Whether or not the job is capable of passing 3 times in a row against the same commit's a little bit harder. We can start to identify that when we enter code freeze, we start creating the release 1.9 branch and only cherry pick commits to add commits to that on a daily basis. So at least for jobs that run frequently, we can see the results of a job running against the same commit a couple times and get an idea of whether it makes sense for it to be included. Want to make sure that we have a SIG that is actually responsive to being pinged by its GitHub team, its test failures GitHub team. And again, based on test grid right now, a job shows up as failing if it fails 10 times in a row. So based on all of these things, I can pretty quickly see whether or not a job is the ideal candidate for release blocking or whether it's misbehaving. And then if it's misbehaving, I'm trying to go triage and poke humans to fix and resolve the situation, but eventually we're going to reach a point where maybe it's kind of time to talk about removing it. So to that end, I just opened up a pull request to talk about removing all the GKE related jobs because they have been failing for about 2 weeks now. And the evidence is just showing that even though I've seen some people working on it, we still have all these jobs failing for 2 weeks. So if we want GKE to be a release blocker, we need to incentivize people to, gather enough resources to actually work the problem. But I recognize this is an iterative process, so I want to make sure we get the right discussion from the right stakeholders. Similarly, so the key thing here is I want to make sure this pull request gets looked at by the owning SIG, which would be SIG GCP, and SIG release, since they kind of own the dashboard. The criteria for merge blocking tests is basically the same. It's just slightly different metrics. It seems like actually most of our pre-submit jobs run in less than 40 minutes on average. Some of them spike up a little bit. Verify runs a little high. And they flake about 20% of the time, regardless of which commit. Fail. They just straight up fail about 80% of the time. And that's expected. It's pull requests. People submit code that will fail tests because people are humans. But this is all stuff that I can glean from test grid. Ideally, moving forward, we want faster, better, smaller tests. Eric was talking about maybe we want to start saying that pre-submits are only single cluster or single node jobs instead of spinning up entire end-to-end clusters, or maybe they're just integration or unit tests. That's great. But I'm trying to put the stake in the ground for today. The other ideal thing, I think, I had mentioned this during stand-up the other day, and I guess I'll stop sharing here, is that it seems pretty likely that test grid it's in a good approximation that I can look at as a human, and a lot of people in the release burn down have been trained to look at. But we have the data in BigQuery to generate a better dashboard with more reasonable or granular metrics. So eventually, once it gets, hopefully, right, once it gets to the point where I can stop chasing people for tests that are failing 10 times in a row, or sorry, jobs that are failing 10 times in a row, I can start identifying like the flakiest tests within those jobs. And while we have a dashboard that does that for pre-submits today, because we get a lot of great traffic there, it could still be useful for like the CI signal person to go say, hey, we noticed that these jobs are still flaking in the CI tests. So I just wanted to run all of that by this group to make sure that seems sane. And I linked the doc in the proposal if you want to drop any comments there. My intent is for Jason and I to turn that into like a markdown and try and enforce it as real actual policy going forward.
I think maybe it might be somewhat outside of the scope of this SIG, but possibly something to throw to Contravex, maybe? I'm not sure if it's the right SIG. I feel like we might need to do more to make sure that SIGs are aware that they need to have someone or someone's monitoring the test failures, and that handle or team. I think if they are aware that if they're not monitoring their failures, we're going to delete them, hopefully they will actually do that, but I'm not sure if we've like told all the SIGs yet.
It's something I'm trying to do as loudly with as much visibility as I can. I'm always wary of the fact that SIG GCP is new and nascent, so this is why like I went to their introductory meeting and gave them the heads up about this. I know they're understaffed, so that's why I raised it during the community meeting where ideally some Google product managers are sitting there publicly saying, yes, we will commit resources to this, so I'm holding them accountable there. The next step would be to have some mailing list traffic on the Kubernetes dev mailing list, and I'm generally pinging the actual SIG channels as well. So I agree, like it's definitely, I can't just like open pull request and say I've done it. I gotta be as vocal about it as possible and recognize that we're all trying here. But I will definitely raise it at Contribex tomorrow because I've like been kind of a big vocal opponent to the GitHub teams with all these prefixes on them and stuff. So this is me genuinely trying to use one of the specific teams for a specific purpose. And everybody keeps talking about like SIGs having on-call rotations and whatnot. And like, I'm not the guy to sit here and tell people how to run their SIG. I'm just acting as a human being who needs a point of contact to get in touch with when tests fail. And so having a unified team across each SIG seems like a good thing for me as a human. And if we find that this works out, it's not too hard to go to then have like some script take the SIG owner out of, you know, wherever the test config data ultimately lands and actually automatically do these notifications.
I also noticed when you opened your PR to make sure that every test has an owner, that like, for example, the Oz SIG like didn't have a test failures team at all.
Yeah, that's a separate thing. I'm gonna go try and chase them down over. And it turns out, in talking with folks, AWS doesn't actually own COPS. SIG Cluster Lifecycle owns COPS. So I'm going to be opening up another PR to ask everybody if they think that is correct. But like I said, my goal here is to try and have as much of these discussions in a pull request-driven workflow as possible. Because eventually I think like anybody should be capable of nominating their job if they feel like it's meeting the criteria. They can open up a pull request, and I've just documented in that proposal what they need to demonstrate, and then the good faith discussion that we will have around like, yeah, this makes sense. Okay. Ben, I'm going to hand it over to you for release 1.9 CI is coming.
So release 1.9 CI is coming. That's Thursday. I have been looking at what we did for the past releases and talking to Sen, who did those. And I think mostly Sen is looking to reorganize the naming finally to be unified for what the jobs are, so it's stable in for each of the releases, and hopefully that will be in before then, which will make it pretty close to a no-op.
And also I'm moving them to like release jobs to be generated, to be like auto-generated, so that we don't need to worry about like, hey, like different serial jobs. Like I update timeout in one job and forgot for the other ones, and the other ones like start to fading or something.
Okay.
That should be unified things.
That's so freaking cool. Yeah, all the release dashboards have slightly different sets of jobs. I'm going to be dropping off the face of the earth Thursday and Friday, but if you can tag me on issues related to that, I'm interested in this as the CI Signal person, because I was just chatting with Eric Chang, who was CI Signal for the last release, and like, I don't know where I should be looking for upgrade jobs. There are like a whole bunch of different dashboards that have the word upgrade on them, and some of them seem redundant. And so like, maybe if we can just kind of hash out like what we think those are supposed to be. Like I will totally take your guidance on what you think the standard should be to stamp stuff out. And if I need to help with that definition, I have today and tomorrow to help out there. But it's ridiculous. There's like masters upgrade, and then kubectl SKU, and then upgrade optional, and then upgrade jobs show up on some of the release dash all boards, and yeah, it's weird.
I can explain this better. So kubectl SKU is for kubectl tasks, like kubectl against like different versions.
Yeah.
That's not upgrading. The master upgrade is probably the dashboard you want to pay attention to. That's the actual upgrade job.
Yeah.
Upgrade optional is for some legacy like container VM upgrade.
Yeah.
Maybe you want to support, but we don't care that much. And we probably want to get rid of them soon.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, I'm gonna pull requests to the like, what do I do docs for CI Signal, and I'm gonna try and clarify like, these are the dashboards I think I need to be paying attention to for upgrade tests, and so I'll just CC you on that to make sure it looks sane.
Okay.
I have one thing to add to the blocking jobs. I didn't see for sure if this is in your doc, but I think at some point we might want to clarify a bit more when they're allowed to run, because I think, for example, if we can get it working again, something like cross should probably block if it's triggered, but it doesn't necessarily run against every PR, but it does run in CI.
Okay.
It's a much longer job, but like if you change the build, we want to make sure build works. So I think right now kind of it triggers and people pay attention to it and try not to merge while breaking it, but it's not enforced yet. But I think in the future there are a few tests like that where we have a pretty good idea if it needs to run or not, and it's going to be slower, and we still might want to block it. And it's a lot slower.
Yeah, that's where I wasn't. I mean, I question whether or not this gets mixed in with Tide and status context on GitHub. There seem to be some pre-submits that aren't blocking, so I'm wondering if it makes sense to break up the dashboards into a pre-submits blocking dashboard and a pre-submits non-blocking dashboard.
If we don't have that, we should definitely make a required dashboard.
Yeah.
Okay. I can probably PR that maybe today. Yeah. If I can't PR it, I'll just file an issue. Yeah, you mentioned pull Kubernetes cross. That's actually been failing for the past day. I wasn't sure if I should.
I think there's a PR to fix that right now, because the problem was that something changed that actually did manage to break it that wasn't in like any of the build or anything. But it's such a huge job that like it's not really reasonable to force every PR to wait for it.
Okay. Yeah, anything else on 1.9 CI?
No, I don't think so. Definitely, I will be setting it up. I think I've got it set, but this guy is like, right across from me and did the last 3. So I will, I think I'm set if we run into any issues.
Okay. So these next 2 are kind of related, but like SIG release wants to know if we have any major migrations planned in the next weeks and whether or not we should think about setting any kind of freeze date for test infra. Before we do that, do we think we could, where do we feel we are on potentially getting Tide rolled out before code freeze?
I don't think we are going to.
I don't think we want to switch to Tide yet. If nothing else, because the UI still isn't there, so people won't have a super great indication what's going on. Also, because Tide right now does require all context to be green, which is a pretty big change from the submit queue. It shouldn't be, but it is. I do think we want to be able to keep. So like for example, I'm almost done migrating the verify job, and when I do, I'm going to follow that up with migrating like cross, etc. But they'll be the same job running in a different place. I think we want to allow. I don't think we want to totally freeze test infra. Do you think we want to stop any plans to turn on or off new tools for KK?
I mean, so the thing I put in there, like, when this was raised last time, I think we kind of agreed that just freezing in general out of paranoia is bad because it hampers the productivity of this team. Small incremental changes are better than letting huge things build up. So it's more about evaluating what we're planning on doing against whether that could be seen as a high risk or destabilizing the queue. So I would just ask you, maybe as like the test infra guy, like if you happen to catch wind of there's some migrations you're doing and you think like, hey, that might be a little disruptive, maybe we should hold off on that until after code freeze, elevate it. And these are the sorts of things that'll start coming up kind of daily during the release burn down period. But like, I think the biggest question for me was whether or not Tide was actually happening. I think like the migration of things out of Munch GitHub to Prow could potentially can keep going on. It's just always this like, be sane.
I think even with that, mostly Cole can check me on this. I think we're mostly migrating other repos like test infra, and kind of like maybe next quarter we'll switch over KK.
Yeah, I mean, I've most of the plugins besides the submit queue are not going to be terribly disruptive, I don't think. It should be pretty easy to move. And since we have enough other repos, I've been able to canary them on test infra and other smaller repos before moving them out. So I think that should be pretty safe to do for at least some of the plugins.
I also think in general, test infra has very much gotten into a place where we're heavily trying things not against anything that affects KK in particular before we switch over. So I think we should be safe to do some migrations that have been canary tested like that, but I don't think we'll be doing anything super disruptive, and we definitely won't be doing anything that hasn't been extensively canaried.
Do we have a plan for testing out Tide? Like, the smaller repos never have a buildup in the queue that requires like large Tide pools. So how are we going to be comfortable making that switch over?
I don't really know that the size of the pool is going to affect Tide much.
It does to some degree, because it affects batch merging rates and like how often we batch merge. So we have been getting batch merges in our repos. They're big enough to periodically get batch merges. So that part's tested to some degree, but it hasn't been tested with load like Steve's talking about.
We could artificially reduce the requirements to try to batch.
Yeah, I think like in general too, we currently have a little bit of a gap in terms of integration testing any of the Prow components. Like Phony exists, but it's not being used in any, like automated way for any of the Prow, like hook stuff. So
we could
maybe that's a gap we just need to focus on in the future.
I don't know that we're actually intending to use Phony at the moment.
Right, I just calling that out as like the only integration level change for test that we actually have.
I do think a Tide migration would actually be relatively safe. I think the things that are going to be breaking are just that it's fundamentally designed differently. Like even now, batch merges are not that reliable. They're pretty easy to break. So if batch merge was acting up a bit, think we'd still be able to fall back. Yeah.
We can do a little bit of testing for that too if we just hold a bunch of stuff in test infra for a day or two and then unleash it all.
Well, I mean, so it decides to batch merge after a certain number of PRs, right?
No, it's always trying to batch merge. It's always trying to launch a batch merge and a single PR, basically. If there's multiple PRs, I guess. It's not a batch if there's just one. But it's trying to, if there's 3 things in the queue, it'll launch a batch.
And we don't currently have a limit on the size of the batch either, right?
Not that I'm aware of. I think it can be 2.
Is there another repo we can canary on?
It's already running on 2 repos, I think, but I think the other one is Federation, which has like nothing in it right now.
As soon as we have,
repo?
What's that?
Can we get a larger repo, or like maybe?
So as soon as we have some sort of UI for it, I think we're pretty happy to put it on Origin.
I think that's kind of the big issue for everyone else too.
I think JetStack was saying that they've adopted it as well.
Yeah, I was talking with him this morning, but it seems like they're a little bit smaller. Yeah, but I mean, like the other blockers for you guys, having the context being green don't matter for us for Origin because we have like that's already happening for our repos. So as soon as we have a UI, I think we're happy to stress test it on ours, which should be a little bit like more throughput.
I think
Joe's got a work in progress PR for the front end, so it's getting close.
we need. I think maybe we should just add a Proud plugin that allows people to like force green. Because like someone can come in right now, drop a /test some random test, and then you're gonna have the status for that, and you can't get rid of it, right? Maybe we could allow like owners or something to.
Macallis did have an experimental refresh plugin that was doing that.
Like run tests again and ignore the stuff that doesn't run.
I think either that or it was reconciling stale context or something of the sort. But maybe that would be an appropriate place to put that code. I think it's still a work in progress PR, but it's somewhere.
Alternatively, what's stopping Tide from like checking the context?
Because it's using the GitHub query that doesn't.
It's using a combined status essentially right now, so it's only getting the actual combined status for all the results.
Right, but could we? I mean, would it actually be a real problem to add another call to get the specific statuses?
No, I don't think that's a barrier.
I think we should probably just do that and have a list. Because to me, I think that's the biggest sticking point to being able to migrate.
Yeah, we could have a list of non-blocking. You mean keep it that instead of a list of blocking jobs, have a list of non-blocking.
I think we might actually want to stick with having a whitelist of blocking.
I feel like Joe might cringe that we're talking about doing something that's not purely GitHub query based, though.
Yeah,
I do, but,
I'm
maybe
wondering
for like during the transition period or something, then we can look at getting rid of that.
Yeah, I like your idea of making it like a prow, maybe like a periodic job or a cron job or something, where like you can run it to sweep. I mean, it's a munger, right? It's going to sweep through PRs and it's going to identify which of the contexts aren't blocking, and then it's going to set those to green, saying, "Hey, this job doesn't exist anymore. Preparing for Tide or something."
Yeah, I'm not sure where exactly makes the most sense, but I think we could have a pretty simple fix somewhere where some component is allowed to wipe away context for jobs that maybe somebody wanted to see or forgot to set skip, or I mean maybe we don't optimize for this and we try to enforce not reporting on GitHub, but somebody's gonna have a stray status and that's gonna block a PR. If we could just wipe away that status quickly.
I mean, today too, they could just push, right? Because the statuses are sticky with the commit.
Are all of them?
No,
Yeah.
I don't think they. I think if you push a new commit, all of the statuses carry forward. The old ones just say like they don't have a result yet.
Yeah.
It looks like a slightly different shade of yellow.
Actually, yeah, there's like a dark gold and there's a gold, and I think it's.
I think that's set up in KK because you guys have required contexts. In repos without that, like we were seeing in some Kubernetes incubator repos, like they just completely go away.
That's probably what that bug was with the submit queue, with the pull Kubernetes cross.
Yeah, that might have been.
The required context on GitHub.
Tide could potentially use that as its source of truth too, as for which contexts are required.
Actually, one of our arguments maybe we need to. Maybe the bug is actually setting the required context. I mean, it seems like developers haven't really paid attention to that, like at all. So maybe we should just stop using that GitHub feature. Because then if that would unsticky them as well, that solves the problem. Then you just like push me.
Are we also like using an endpoint to do merges that honors the required contexts?
Yeah, it clicks the button. It uses the button click endpoint or whatever. I think the thing with required context means that you have to be an admin to manually click the button as opposed to just having write privileges on the repo. And the idea is that there are way more people who have write privileges to KK than who have admin.
A required context on Tide status.
Ah, okay.
And Tide can post the status on what it thinks about the PR.
That might be valid. So we're kind of over time here. I think like this is something we should hash out in an issue or breakout or something. I would normally keep going, but I kind of have to run. I guess the other thing that popped in my head about potentially breaking migrations would be the approval handler that we've been canarying on other repos. Is that something we would anticipate turning on for KK, or are we going to stick with Munge GitHub?
I'm planning to turn that on to KK. It's been working everywhere that I've deployed it so far. The only difference is that it's faster and less buggy.
No.
There was 3 repos that I wanted to apply it to, and I made PRs for that. And I've applied to 2 of them today. I'll do the last one, and then once that's in, I'll do KK later this week.
And that would be my argument towards the only reason we might still want to consider, hashing out this Tide stuff and making it happen is that the Munge GitHub tool chain is quite buggy and stops us from doing things like making cross-blocking. It would be great to migrate to Tide, which is much smaller and easier to debug.
Yeah, I really want to see that happen, but I just want to make sure we're diligent about keeping things predictable, even if they're buggy. So I do like the idea that like we've canaried different handlers or plugins, and we can migrate those over, because that means, when somebody complains about a problem, we can't necessarily say, oh, that's Munge GitHub, it's dead code, we're not fixing it. We actually have the power to fix it because it's PROW. Anyway, this actually ran way longer than I thought it would. Thank you, everybody, for the constructive discussion, and happy Tuesday. I'll see you all online.
Happy Tuesday.